was a cold October evening, and the chill had settled into the house like an unwanted guest. The wind outside howled softly, rattling the windows and causing the bare branches of the trees to scratch against the panes. I had bundled up in a thick sweater and wrapped myself in a blanket, settling into my worn-out recliner in the living room, hoping to relax and distract myself from the loneliness that always seemed to creep in with the longer, darker nights. The TV flickered softly in front of me, the muted glow casting long shadows across the walls. I wasn't paying much attention to it, a rerun of some old crime show I'd seen a dozen times before, but the steady hum of voices and music provided a kind of comforting background noise. I sipped my lukewarm tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and tried to lose myself in the mundane predictability of the plot. I must have been dozing off because the sudden change in the room startled me. One moment, I was staring blankly at the familiar show, and the next, the screen went black, then crackled to life again, but something was off. The channel had changed on its own. I blinked, confused, sitting up straighter in the chair. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched, and I hadn't leaned on any buttons. I glanced around the room, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach, but everything was the same, silent, still. I looked back at the TV, squinting at the screen. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. It was my living room, the same room I was sitting in, down to every last detail, the faded wallpaper, the clutter of books on the side table, even the old blanket draped over the back of the couch. But it wasn't just a similar room. It was my living room. The camera seemed to be positioned at a low angle, as if it were perched somewhere near the floor, looking up at the very spot I was sitting. My heart started to pound. I leaned forward, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no mistaking it. I was watching a live feed of my own house. But there was no camera in my living room, nothing that could be broadcasting this image. And then I saw it. A figure moved into frame, stepping into view from the hallway. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The same hair, the same build, wearing the same sweater I had on now. But there was something wrong. The figure, the me on the screen, wasn't quite right. It stood in the center of the room, staring at the spot where I was sitting. And it was smiling. Not a normal smile, either. It was a wide, unnatural grin, the kind of smile that stretched too far, pulling the lips back to reveal too much of the teeth. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was no warmth in them, no recognition. Just that awful, empty smile. I jerked back in my chair, my pulse racing. The figure on the screen didn't move, just stood there, grinning at me. I reached for the remote with shaking hands, fumbling to change the channel, to turn off the TV, but the screen didn't respond. The image remained, unchanging, frozen in that bizarre tableau. I dropped the remote, my hands slick with sweat. My gaze darted around the room, searching for what? There was no one else here, just me alone in my living room, watching myself. I glanced back at the screen, and my stomach dropped. The other me was moving again. Slowly, with deliberate, jerky motions, it began to walk forward. Step by step, it approached the camera, the grin never wavering, the eyes never leaving mine. The closer it got, the more distorted its face became, the grin stretching wider, the teeth sharper, almost serrated. It moved as if it were struggling against invisible strings, its arms hanging limply at its sides. My heart was hammering in my chest, my skin prickling with cold fear. I stood up from the chair, backing away from the TV. As I moved, the figure on the screen tilted its head slightly, its grin widening. It paused for a moment, as if studying me, then raised one hand slowly, lifting it to point at the camera, at me. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter around me. I glanced around, half expecting to see what? The other me, standing in the corner, that awful grin fixed in place. I forced myself to breathe, to think. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was some kind of sick joke, a glitch, a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure took another step forward, filling the screen. Its eyes were black now, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. The grin stretched impossibly wide, the lips splitting at the corners. And then it spoke. But the sound didn't come from the TV. It came from behind me. "Hello," it whispered, the voice low and rasping like dry leaves scraping together. My blood ran cold, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. The living room was empty, no one there, no other me. Just the silent house, the shadows deepening in the corners, the TV flickering softly behind me. But I had heard it, I knew I had heard it. That voice, that awful rasping whisper. It was too close, too real. Slowly I turned back to the TV. The other me was still there, its face pressed almost up against the camera now, filling the screen. The eyes, black, empty voids, seemed to bore into me, and the grin was all wrong. It wasn't just smiling, it was mocking me. "Are you scared?" it whispered, its voice crackling through the speakers. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This wasn't possible. It was some kind of nightmare, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But no matter how many times I blinked, how many times I pinched myself, the scene on the screen didn't change. The other me tilted its head, still grinning. "I can see you," it whispered. I took a step back, bumping into the coffee table. The grin on its face widened even further, stretching the skin taut, the lips splitting. The corners of its mouth began to bleed, thin rivulets of dark red trickling down its chin. "I'm coming," it rasped. I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, the cold metal slipping under my fingers. I could hear it behind me, the soft, shuffling sound of bare feet on carpet, the low, rasping breath. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the night, the icy air hitting me like a slap. I ran, my feet pounding on the pavement, my breath misting in the cold. I didn't stop until I was at the end of the street, my chest burning, my lungs aching. I turned back, half expecting to see it standing in the doorway, watching me with that awful grin. But the house was dark, silent. The front door was closed, the windows blank and empty. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath, my eyes fixed on the living room window. There was no movement, no sign of anything. Slowly, I took a step forward, my heart still racing. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of waking nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion? I edged closer to the house, my eyes scanning the windows for any sign of that figure. And then, in the darkness, I saw it. A face, just visible behind the living room window, its features twisted into that same unnatural grin. My face. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and the grin widened, the teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Come home," it whispered. I turned and ran, the voice echoing in my ears. The grin burned into my mind. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would be waiting. Waiting for the moment I stepped back inside. Waiting for me to come home. It was late, and the streets were empty as I walked home from my shift at the diner. The air was crisp, the chill of autumn biting through my thin jacket. Dead leaves crunched under my feet as I made my way down the deserted sidewalk, their brittle rustling the only sound in the stillness. The only light came from the occasional flickering street lamp and the orange glow of carved pumpkins on doorsteps. Halloween was only a few days away, and the neighborhood had already started decorating. Plastic skeletons dangled from porches, and fake spiderwebs stretched across hedges, giving the quiet street an eerie feel. I wasn't usually nervous walking home at night. I'd done it 100 times before, and our small town was as quiet as they come. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the cold wind that seemed to whisper through the empty streets, or the fact that I hadn't seen a single car pass by in the last half hour. Whatever it was, I found myself walking faster, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Halfway home, I took a shortcut through the park, the path winding through clusters of trees that stood tall and dark against the sky. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches overhead. I was almost to the other side when I noticed it, a shadow moving behind me. I glanced back, my heart skipping a beat. A man was standing at the entrance to the park, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees. His silhouette was unmistakable, a tall, broad figure, dressed in dark clothes. His face was obscured, but there was something about the way he stood, unmoving, just watching me. I quickened my pace, my skin prickling. The path curved ahead, and I kept my eyes fixed forward, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. When I finally dared to glance back again, the man was gone. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or someone out for a late walk like me. Still, I didn't slow down. The sooner I got home, the better. I exited the park and turned onto Elm Street, the familiar houses lining the road a welcome sight. Most of the windows were dark, the residents long since gone to bed. I shoved my hands into my pockets, head down, and kept moving. But as I passed under a street lamp, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement, just behind me. I looked back and my stomach dropped. The man was there again, closer this time. He was walking slowly, deliberately, his face still hidden in the shadows. But I could see it now. He was wearing a mask. Not one of those cheap plastic Halloween masks you see at costume shops, but something different, something more disturbing. It was an old, cracked porcelain mask, painted to look like a doll's face. The eyes were large and empty, the smile fixed in a cruel, mocking grin. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. He stopped too, just standing there, staring at me from behind that grotesque mask. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of prank? A twisted joke? I turned and started walking again, faster now, almost jogging. I could hear his footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, but he never sped up. He just kept following me, the distance between us closing little by little. Panic set in. I was still a few blocks from home, and there was no one else around. The houses were dark, the streets empty. I could run, but would it make a difference? He was too close now. I could feel his gaze boring into the back of my neck, and every instinct screamed at me to get away. I broke into a run. The sound of my footsteps echoed loudly in the empty street, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. But then I heard it, his footsteps, quickening to match mine. I risked a glance back and saw him gaining on me, his long legs eating up the distance between us effortlessly. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. The houses blurred past, my vision narrowing as I focused on just one thing: getting away. I turned the corner sharply, nearly slipping on the wet pavement, and sprinted down the next block. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear him behind me, the steady thud of his boots against the ground, the rasp of his breathing through that awful mask. I rounded another corner and nearly crashed into a fence blocking the alleyway. Panic surged as I realized I'd trapped myself. I turned around, chest heaving, and saw him standing at the mouth of the alley, his figure silhouetted by the dim streetlights. I backed up slowly, my gaze locked on his mask. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step at a time, his head cocked slightly to the side as if amused by my fear. My back hit the fence, and I realized there was nowhere left to go. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just kept moving toward me, each step slow and methodical, savoring the moment. I searched frantically for something, anything to defend myself, but the alley was empty except for a few piles of garbage bags. I grabbed the closest one and flung it at him, but he barely reacted, batting it aside with a casual swipe of his hand. I pressed myself against the fence, my pulse roaring in my ears. He was close now, so close I could see the cracks in the porcelain mask, the way the moonlight reflected off its smooth surface. His hand reached into his pocket, and I flinched, expecting to see a knife, a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a small piece of paper. He held it out to me, tilting his head slightly, as if daring me to take it. With trembling fingers, I reached for the paper. He didn't move, his gaze never leaving mine as I unfolded it slowly. My eyes widened as I read the words scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "I've been watching you." My blood turned to ice. I looked up, my breath hitching. He was standing right in front of me now, so close I could see my own terrified reflection in the blank eyes of his mask. Then he moved, fast, faster than I could react. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist in a grip like iron. I tried to scream, to struggle, but he shoved me back hard, my head slamming against the fence. Stars exploded in my vision, and I felt the world spin around me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was that grotesque, smiling mask. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, damp pavement. My head throbbed, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. The chase, the alley, the masked man. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around wildly. The alley was empty. There was no sign of him anywhere. But as I turned to run, my foot kicked something small and crumpled. The piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and unfolded it again. But this time, there was a new message written beneath the first one. "See you again soon." My heart nearly stopped. I spun around, searching the shadows, but the alley was empty. The street beyond was empty. The entire town felt deserted, but I knew he was out there, watching, waiting, and he'd be back. The snow started falling steadily as I drove deeper into the forest, the winding road slick and treacherous under my tires. It wasn't even supposed to snow this early, but that was October for you. Unpredictable, raw, and sometimes cruel. I had been putting off this trip for years, but something inside me had finally given in. Maybe it was a sense of obligation, or maybe it was just the need for some isolation. Whatever the reason, I found myself heading to my parents' old cabin, hidden away in the woods where the trees loomed tall and dark. They'd passed a few years ago, leaving the place abandoned. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Life just seemed to get in the way, and besides, there were too many memories here, both good and bad. Now, though, I figured it was time to sort through their things, clear out what was left, and finally decide what to do with the property. The drive took longer than expected, the snow turning the road into a narrow white ribbon. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the headlights illuminated its weathered exterior. It looked the same as it had in my childhood: dark wood, a slanted roof, and a porch that creaked even in the wind. Snow blanketed the ground, and everything was deathly silent except for the gentle patter of flakes hitting the earth. I killed the engine and got out, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The key slid into the old lock with a familiar click, and I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The cabin was freezing inside, the kind of deep, bone-chilling cold that settles into an empty place. I flicked on the light switch, and a single bulb buzzed to life, casting a weak glow over the living room. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and decay. I stood for a moment, listening to the silence, then shook off the unease that crept over me. I didn't have time for nerves. I set down my bag and got to work, moving from room to room, checking for any damage and making a mental list of what needed to be done. Most of the stuff was as my parents had left it: blankets folded neatly on the beds, old family photos lining the walls, the kitchen cupboard still stocked with outdated canned goods. After a few hours of cleaning and clearing out the downstairs, I decided to head up to the attic. It was the one place I had always avoided when I was a kid. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, even then. But now, it seemed like the logical place to start. Old clothes, holiday decorations, and probably a lot of junk I'd have to sort through. The attic stairs creaked loudly as I climbed, the narrow wooden steps groaning under my weight. I pushed open the trap door and climbed inside. The air up here was colder, the rafters lined with cobwebs that caught in the dim light of the single, naked bulb swinging overhead. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, and I shivered as I moved through the dusty space. As I started sifting through an old trunk filled with my dad's belongings, a prickling sensation ran down my spine, and I realized something felt off. I stopped and looked around, my gaze drifting to the small, dirty window on the far side of the attic. The glass was frosted over, but beyond it, through the swirling snow, I could just make out the silhouette of another cabin. The neighbor's cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't thought about that place in years. The Thompsons used to live there, a quiet older couple who would wave at me from their porch whenever I visited as a kid. They'd always been kind, baking cookies for me and my sister, telling us stories of the woods. But they'd both died a few years back in a car accident. After that, their cabin had been left to rot, just like ours. And yet, as I peered through the fogged-up window, I could see a faint, flickering light inside the Thompsons' cabin. I squinted, leaning closer to the glass. The light wasn't strong, just a dull orange glow, but it was unmistakable. My pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone there. No one had lived in that cabin for years. Maybe it was just a reflection or some kind of trick of the light, I told myself. But then I saw movement. Two figures stood at the window, facing me. Even from this distance, I could make out the shapes of their heads, the curve of their shoulders. They were standing still, perfectly still, watching me. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, my heart thudding in my chest. It was impossible. I knew it was. The Thompsons were dead. I blinked, my hands trembling, but the figures didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me through the falling snow. A cold dread seeped into my bones as I realized that they were standing exactly where I remembered their living room window being. They hadn't moved a muscle since I'd spotted them. It was as if they were frozen in place. Slowly, I turned away from the window, trying to shake the icy fear that gripped me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus on the task at hand. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I was tired. I was alone. The snow and the dark can make you see things that aren't there. But the fear didn't go away. It stayed with me, a heavy, suffocating weight. I tried to distract myself by going through the boxes, pulling out old photo albums, musty clothes, and stacks of brittle newspapers. But every few minutes, I found myself glancing back at the window, expecting to see them again. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I moved back to the window and looked out. The figures were gone. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by confusion. The light in the cabin was still there, flickering faintly through the snow, but the shapes were gone. I leaned closer, pressing my face to the cold glass, trying to see into the dark cabin across the way. Then the light went out. My heart dropped. The darkness beyond the window was complete, the snow swirling outside, making it impossible to see anything. I stepped back, my breath fogging up the glass. I was being ridiculous, I knew that. There was no one in that cabin. It was just an empty, abandoned house. I turned to leave the attic, but as I did, a soft creak sounded from the far corner of the room. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Slowly, I turned the beam toward the sound. There, at the far end of the attic, was a small door, one I didn't remember being there before. It was half open, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. My skin prickled, and I took a step back. And then I heard it, a faint sound drifting from the open door, a whisper, my name. I spun around, my pulse racing, and bolted for the attic stairs. I stumbled down, nearly falling in my haste, and slammed the trapdoor shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The cabin was silent, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced out the living room window, half expecting to see the Thompsons staring back at me from their darkened cabin, but there was nothing there, just the snow and the empty woods. I turned away and froze. The Thompsons were standing on my porch. They were right outside the window, their faces pale and twisted in the dim light. They were smiling, their eyes wide and unblinking. Slowly, they raised their hands and pressed them against the glass, their fingers leaving smudges on the pane. I stumbled back, my legs trembling. The door was locked. It had to be locked, but the knob turned slowly, and then the door swung open. It was late October, and a heavy snowstorm had rolled in earlier that evening, blanketing everything in a thick, unbroken sheet of white. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old wooden house groan. I had been planning on a quiet night, curled up on the couch with a book, ignoring the rest of the world as I watched the snow pile up. The place felt colder than usual, despite the heating being turned all the way up. The weather had been strange lately, the first snow coming early and hitting hard. The house, an old family home I'd inherited, was already isolated at the best of times, perched on a small hill at the edge of town. With the snowstorm raging, it felt completely cut off. I remember looking at the clock. It was just past midnight, when the power went out. The sudden darkness caught me off guard, the soft glow of my reading lamp vanishing, leaving only the dim light of the fireplace, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. I cursed under my breath and stood up, feeling my way through the room. My phone was upstairs on the charger, but I knew the battery was low. I reached the kitchen and fumbled in the drawer for a flashlight, finally finding it and flicking it on. A weak, flickering beam illuminated the small, narrow space. The house was utterly silent, except for the wind howling outside, battering against the walls and roof. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the swirling white of the blizzard. Everything was buried under snow, and the thought of going out to check the power box was laughable. I sighed, deciding I'd have to make do until the storm passed. And then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A knock. Just once, a heavy, deliberate sound against the front door. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I hadn't seen or heard another soul all night. No one would be out in this weather, not in the middle of a snowstorm. I strained to listen, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Maybe it was a branch, blown loose by the wind. I tried to convince myself of that, but something about the sound didn't fit. It was too purposeful. Another knock, louder this time. Whoever it was, they were out there, standing in the freezing dark. I took a step back, glancing over my shoulder toward the front hallway. I should have just ignored it. No one would be out here, and not unless they were in serious trouble. But something compelled me forward, something I couldn't quite name. The flashlight's beam wavered as I approached the door, the rest of the house swallowed in shadows. I hesitated at the threshold, my breath misting in the cold air. The knock came again, insistent, reverberating through the silent house. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding small and weak. No response. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the wood, trying to listen. The wind howled, the snow battered against the walls, but beneath it, I could hear something else. A soft, muffled sound, like the crunch of boots on fresh snow. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Still no answer. I should have walked away right then, gone back to the safety of the living room, but instead, I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open, the icy wind whipping past me, and I squinted into the darkness. The snow fell thick and fast, swirling around in a chaotic dance, but I could make out the shape of someone standing just beyond the porch steps. "Do you need help?" I shouted over the storm. The figure didn't move. It was hard to see clearly through the blizzard, but they were tall, dressed in dark, heavy clothing, their outline blurred by the falling snow. They just stood there, motionless, facing the house. Something about the way they were standing made my skin crawl. They weren't shivering, weren't hunched against the cold. They were just still, like they were waiting. "Who are you?" I called, but the wind snatched my words away. For a long moment, the figure didn't respond. Then, slowly, they took a step forward, the crunch of snow audible even over the roar of the storm. I took an instinctive step back, gripping the doorframe tightly. "Do you need help?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The figure took another step, and I caught a glimpse of their face, or what should have been a face. But there was only darkness, as if the hood of their coat was an empty void. A chill that had nothing to do with the storm crept down my spine. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and slammed the door shut. The wood rattled in its frame, and I threw the deadbolt, my hands shaking. What the hell was that? I stood there, breathing hard, listening. The wind screamed outside, but I couldn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no knocking, just the storm raging in the night. I took a step back, then another, my eyes fixed on the door. What had I seen out there? Was it just a trick of the light, the snow distorting shapes, or had there really been someone standing out there, staring at me? Then, without warning, the knocking started again. But this time it wasn't on the front door. It was coming from the back of the house. The sound echoed through the darkened rooms, a heavy, deliberate pounding. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing crazily over the walls as I tried to pinpoint the source. The knocking was louder now, more insistent, reverberating through the empty halls. I backed away, my heart racing. There was no one outside. There couldn't be anyone outside. The snow was too deep, the storm too fierce. I was alone here. I had to be. But the knocking continued, shifting now, moving along the walls of the house. First at the back door, then at the side windows, then closer, as if someone was circling the cabin, pounding on every surface they passed. I stumbled into the living room, my head spinning, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my chest. The flashlight flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing by the front windows. I whipped around, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Then the knocking stopped. I stood there, trembling, listening to the wind howl outside. The house was silent again, the only sound the faint creaking of the old beams settling in the cold. And then slowly, the doorknob turned. I watched, paralyzed, as the front door rattled in its frame, the deadbolt straining against the pressure. Someone was outside, Someone was trying to get in. I backed away, my mouth dry, my hands slick with sweat. The knob twisted again, harder this time, the wood groaning under the force. Then, with a sudden violent snap, the door swung open, slamming against the wall. The wind roared into the house, carrying with it a flurry of snow. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. But it was closer now, clearer. The dark hood, the heavy coat. No face, just an empty, hollow void where eyes and a mouth should be. I could feel its gaze on me, even without eyes to see. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I sprinted through the house. The shadows seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. I reached the kitchen, threw open the door to the basement, and stumbled down the steps, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there in the pitch darkness, my chest heaving, listening. The wind howled outside, the house creaked and groaned, but above all that, I could hear it. The soft, steady sound of footsteps, moving through the house above me. They moved slowly, deliberately, pausing at every door, every corner. Closer, always closer. I held my breath, the darkness pressing in around me, praying it wouldn't find me. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside the basement door, and the knob began to turn.